Oh. I hope that you enjoy. Thank you for joining us today for our exciting webinar entitled Housing Solutions Insights from the Financialization of Housing Lab. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the different lands on which we gather. For me now, they're the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the people of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who have nurtured, loved, and lived on this land since time immemorial. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to create, collaborate, live, and work on this land and commit to do my best to take care of it as a guest here. Hi, I'm Claire, and I'm part of the ECHO CMHC team. Before we begin, I just have a few notes that I'd like to remind attendees. We'll have about 10 minutes after the panel discussion to discuss. So if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, drop them into the chat box, and we look forward to discussing afterwards. Our webinars are member-driven, therefore the words and opinions expressed by the presenters are entirely their own. We encourage you to connect with the presenters after the webinar. Their emails will be posted in chat, and there will be a follow-up email with possible unanswered questions, some documents from the Financialization of Housing Lab, and any information. After this webinar, if you have further questions or if you'd like to know more, please email the CMHC address that will be also linked in the chat box. This webinar is being simultaneously translated, therefore it can be experienced in both English and in French. On the bottom panel of your screen, you should see a world icon with the word interpretation underneath. Press on it and you will be able to see both language choices, so you can listen in either room. Our last two slide decks were not able to be translated into French. However, please contact us if you would like the French documents, and we can make them available to you in a follow-up email. If you can mute your mics and turn off your cameras during the presentation, that'd be really appreciated so that we can hear and see all the presenters and panelists clearly. If you are joining us through a phone and are muted, press *6 to unmute during our discussion period if you may talk. This event will be recorded and will be uploaded onto the ECHO platform in the next few days. ECHO is a platform for collaboration, networking, and knowledge sharing across the housing realm. If you'd like to know more or like to become a member or interested, there's also going to be a link in the chat so you can register. So thank you all again for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the chat, and we hope you enjoy the webinar. Over to you, Marian.
Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome everyone. So good to see you here and so excited to be sharing space with you and lessons and learnings that we've accumulated as teams and partners over the last 2+ years. I want to really quickly center us and embody our land acknowledgement a little. This is one of the practices that we also incorporated in our lab design and the way this lab was practiced. So one of the key things we wanted to focus on was this idea of housing being enabled by home, and what does it take to create home. And so I invite you to take a minute with me and reimagine, reconnect with home. And so we're going to do a quick meditation practice where you can either close your eyes or you can focus your gaze on a neutral spot. And when you're ready, just take a deep breath in and feel it go down into your gut. And focus on your breath. And try and remember what home feels like to you. This might be your childhood home. This might be a person. This might be where you are right now, or a community where you feel like you belong. And take a deep breath in and focus on how that makes you feel. What does home feel like to you? What does home rise in you? Take another few breaths and let yourself keep that feeling in. And when you're ready, come back to us at the center. We do these embodied practices because in this fast-paced world that we live in, it's often very hard to connect in an embodied way with some of these concepts. So we remain really stuck in the head, but find really little time to connect with the heart and the gut. And so this was the core, one of our core practices in this lab, was to try and connect the idea of housing back to home and the idea of home back to land. And so with that, I want to acknowledge the land I'm on. This is the Haldiman Tract, which is 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, promised to the indigenous nations, some parts of it returned, others not. It has been stewarded and loved by and cared for by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutrals people. And it's now known as Kitchener-Waterloo. If you feel so inclined, please share in the chat the lands that you're calling from as well. And with that grounding piece, I want to pass it on to Andrea Nempton, our CEO at SI Canada, and one of the key brains behind this fantastic lab. So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Miriam. You know, there was hundreds of key brains in this lab, and I was but one of them. And thank you for that grounding exercise. You know, it's really easy when you're talking about housing and funding and financing, and it's almost like a puzzle to solve. And so it really is important for us to always sort of come back to what is the actual outcome. The actual outcome is that more people have homes that they feel safe and happy and can thrive in. This has been an incredible experience. I think it's been probably 2.5 years that we've been working with the CMHC on this directed lab. And it started with, and CMHC and SI Canada, it was originated by CSI. And then when I moved to SI Canada, I sort of made sure I could take it with me. And SI Canada and CMHC have been working very, very closely. And with the support of the Van City Community Foundation was one of our strong supporters. They actually came in at one of the most crucial moments to be able to continue the work. They've got such a long track record in supporting affordable housing in innovative ways. And so I want to give a big shout out to them. As I mentioned, hundreds of people have contributed to this lab and to this thinking. Academics and advocates and financiers and developers and nonprofit housing providers and financial institutions and affordable housing funds. And everyone has come to the table and the range of perspectives were very far. Financialization of housing was at first, when we started, not known as a term, and then throughout the lab went through a bit of a fraught moment in time when it was starting to be politicized in quite a long way, and there was a lot of different perspectives on it, and a lot of it was very complex, and we were really grateful that people were able to, no matter whether they were coming from the rights, housing as a human right, or from the sort of traditional affordable housing fund or financial institution, or real PAC, and all the for-profit developers, the nonprofit developers, and the academics came in to be able to center those who are in core housing need, and how do we get them homes that they can afford that meet their needs in the middle of the conversation, and sort of leave the rest of the stuff at the door. We started with trying to understand the system. Well, first we started understanding what financialization was, then to understand the system, to really look at some of the impacts, and then move to solutions. And so today you're going to be able to hear some of the insights from the groups that we're working on prototypes for solutions to try and address the impacts. And in that, I want to hand it over to my partner in crime, Andrew Cowan, who is going to be able to say a few words about CMHC and how this worked with their strategy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't. Oh. And at the end, I'll tell you that this fits with SI Canada in the way that we are working to address complex challenges at a national level through social innovation approaches and practices. So forgot to do my commercial. Over to Andrew.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to echo a lot of the messages that you just mentioned. And I am truly very excited about today's webinar. And on behalf of CMHC, I want to thank everyone on the webinar for attending. And I really do hope you find the Financialization and Housing Lab story of interest and value to you. And I encourage you to follow up with Andrea or myself anytime. But before I do that, and sort of what CMHC's interest in funding this lab and contributing in its journey was, I would like to provide you with some information about the actual NHS Solution Labs program. So the Solution Lab is a program under the National Housing Strategy, and it fuels inclusive, collaborative, bottom-up innovation by bringing together diverse groups of people to solve complex, affordable housing problems. It is very unique in that the solutions are developed by housing stakeholders for consideration by governments and others, other decision makers, those who can act on those solutions. And so once the solutions are identified and co-developed, they're prototyped and they're tested. A roadmap to implement and scale the prototype solutions is the final step in the lab process, describing the pathway to implementation and scaling. The goal of the program is to develop solutions to our most complex and challenging housing problems that contribute to the National Housing Strategy's key priority areas and shared outcomes. And if you haven't heard of the program and you are interested in learning more about the program, please visit our web pages. There should be a URL pasted in the chat that you can link to and read more. Regarding today's webinar, as Andrea said, it has been a challenging and I'd have to say very rewarding journey, to say the least. When we started the lab 2 years ago, economic and social conditions were much different. And I am sure you would agree that those conditions have exacerbated and made us all double down on looking for solutions on how we can continue to protect and improve the housing system for everyone in Canada. There are innovative solutions, as you will hear today, to improve that system so it can work for our most vulnerable people who have and are experiencing extremely challenging barriers to safe, affordable, and adequate housing. Without this basic right, so many other opportunities in life become extremely limiting and difficult to overcome. CMHC's interest in being a partner and funding this lab was to understand what the current housing finance landscape was, how did current and past financial policies and practices affect possible solutions or enable potential collaborations to build solutions for those in greatest need of housing, our most vulnerable people. Along with SI Canada and other participants, we wanted to explore what exactly this very loaded and at times divisive term financialization meant in the Canadian context, how the associated system pieces or elements of the term manifested in the system, and may have created unintended consequences for our most vulnerable people. The lab set out to discover how working, and I must emphasize this as Andrea has, how working collectively within the housing system with all actors, what solutions could be identified and prototyped. That's a collaboration between private sector, housing actors, investors, government actors, philanthropic organizations, community organizations, human rights groups, and not-for-profit affordable housing actors has been and continues to be one of the greatest attributes of the approach of the program and of what this lab itself took in its work. I'm grateful, and I really do want to thank SI Canada and Andrea's team for their tireless efforts to frame up this complex issue and to gather the actors with commitments to developing solutions and an openness to dialogue. I would also like to thank all of the leads of the prototype groups and their working team participants. Their passion and commitment to contributing meaningful solutions has been inspiring. I also would be remiss not to mention my many colleagues at CMHC that also supported the lab, and in particular, Leah Vigi, who worked tirelessly and with great conviction alongside the team. And with that, I will turn it back over. Enjoy the presentation today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Echoing all of what Andrew and Andrea said, this was an all hands on deck lab. It was one of the key pieces that pulled us together as the lead designer of the lab. The most beautiful thing that emerged was the way different stakeholders and communities came together, self-governed around these problems, and then co-created solutions in partnership. So a quick overview of some of the solution ideas that came up, and you're going to hear more about today. We had clusters that focused on building community wealth through affordable housing, others who were looking at social finance as a lever and a tool for small municipalities, but also more affordable housing. A cluster that was focused on partnering with Indigenous and BIPOC communities for sustainable construction, the role that private developers can play in supporting the creation of healthy communities, and using new innovative social and other finance models to increase shared equity, to increase access and funding for affordable housing, and to increase affordable housing supply as a whole. So our next little piece is going to be a series of lightning talks from 6 speakers who were spread out across these cluster areas. We're going to first hear from Mike DeGagne and Kaylin Taylor. Mike is the trades training coordinator at Keepers of the Circle, and Kaylin is the executive director of Purpose Construction. So we're going to start with Mike first and then pass it to Kaylin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike DeGagne. I'm a Métis Algonquin father, husband, and off-grid homesteader here in Northern Ontario, Treaty 9 territory, and I'm the trades training coordinator with Keepers of the Circle, a nonprofit organization working to create clear pathways to employment for Indigenous women in the Timiskaming district and across the province and indeed the country. Through our program development, it became clear that the people that are in the most need are the most excluded from every aspect of our current housing paradigm. And so we asked ourselves, how might we give Indigenous women, gender diverse people, and marginalized communities not only stake in, but also benefit from the design, construction, ownership, and maintenance of housing in Northern Ontario? In order to achieve holistic systems change, we must learn to do things differently. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great. Firstly, we have to learn how to train differently. Keepers of the Circle has, for the last 25 years, been training Indigenous women in non-traditional sectors. Training programs connect online learning with hands-on training, creating the low-carbon workforce of the future. Partnerships with local contractors and communities means that our labor stays here and sustainable pathways to employment can exist in perpetuity. All of our prospective trades trainees go through Keepers of the Circle's flagship program, Culture, Confidence, and Competence, a traditionally rooted pre-employment program that breaks down the barriers for employment for our members and provides the training that they need to be successful with the rest of their employment. Next slide, please. We're also designing different. Our ecological, modular, and passive prototype consists of interchangeable wall panel systems that allow for design and construction of any size building from 100 to 10,000 square feet and beyond. Our prototype will be 80% more efficient than traditional code-built homes It will be built with local sustainable building materials and incorporate alternative infrastructure systems such as solar, wind, and water collection in order to create utility independence in rural and remote communities. Next slide, please. Our modular homes are not only designed differently, it's built differently as well. Panels are built indoors, allowing for year-round assembly and the removal of any safety risks associated with the construction sector across the north. Once constructed, our interchangeable wall panel systems can be warehoused and stored long-term and installed in a matter of days, effectively creating an almost instant solution to seasonal, social, or climate-related housing crisis. And by building as a training program, we're able to offset quite a bit of the cost that goes into developing some of these homes. Next slide, please. Lastly, housing is recognized as a human right, but it is traded and marketed as a commodity. And so Keepers of the Circle is exploring opportunities to include matriarchal land trusts in order to offset the cost of land from the cost of homes, worker-owned cooperatives that give voice and control over labor to the people on the ground doing the work, a social enterprise contracting company facilitating the employment and delivery of low-carbon solutions for the future in the north, and lastly, the creation of a fund that will act as leverage through credit unions, effectively allowing no or low interest, quote unquote, mortgages in the form of term loans to be given without risking land tenure or security for the prospective owner. Next slide, please. These are some pictures from the training that is actually ongoing. We're starting the development of our prototype on Monday. We're hoping to be complete construction by the end of December, and we'll be installing the home in the Timiskaming district in January for one of the participants that is going through the training right now. Next slide, please. A quick diagram of our first prototype, which is a nearly 500 square foot home that was designed by the women that are going through the program. I think that'll be it for my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Every time I hear you, I'm inspired. Passing it on to Kaylin.
Oh, I hate following Mike because it's such a fantastic program model, and I just love seeing how it's coming along. You'll see that our project is closely related with Mike's. We shared a focus area in a lot of ways. So I'm Kaylin Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of Purpose Construction. We are a social enterprise contracting company providing training and employment to folks with barriers. Primarily, we're working with Indigenous folks, often coming out of the justice system, youth coming out of the care system, refugees and newcomer Canadians, women and members of the LGBT+ community. We've been around for about 15 years now, doing a ton of work in social housing. We do a lot of apartment turnovers. But as we were growing and looking to the future, we became really interested in how we could deepen the impact of our work by maintaining the trades training component, but adding in an affordable housing development element. Next slide, please. So in focusing on affordable housing development, we were responding to basically me getting told what to do by a number of Indigenous matriarchs in our community who led and took part in the North End Housing Lab, which was an Indigenous-led lab process looking at the north end of Winnipeg and what is it that we need to make housing accessible and sustainable for communities. So increased access to affordable housing development, specifically larger units, was identified really, really quickly as a priority, as well as opportunities for job training. So the project for us really became, how do we build affordable housing? How do we maintain the trades training we've been doing for 15 years? And how do we make sure also that the houses we're building are green and accessible, physically accessible? Next slide, please. So the model that we settled on kind of through this lab process was, I mean, pretty clearly social enterprise, affordable housing development. So it's our trainees building the house from beginning to end, and a shared equity mortgage model. So the shared equity model we're using allows low-income families to purchase the home at a reduced upfront cost, about 75% of the cost of construction. We then hold a second mortgage on that house for about 25% of the value of the home. No interest is paid until the house is sold, in which case it's a lump sum, and we share in the increase or decrease in the value of the land. the way that we structured the shared equity mortgage, at least in the pilot year, means that the low-income families don't have to come up with a down payment. This was the sort of #1 barrier identified by that North End Housing Lab. So that has been a real focus of our work so far. Next slide, please. So we've started prototyping early summer of this year with our first build. It's a 4-bedroom, I say highly efficient, but after Mike's presentation, we're only 20% better than code. I think what they're doing at 80% better than code is absolutely goals. I would love to be there. I think the way they're doing the modular design is so cool. So we are about probably 70% of the way done through the initial prototype model. We are currently in the process of identifying the purchasing family right now and moving through kind of structuring that shared equity mortgage. We are learning a ton. There's a lot we'll do differently next year, but absolutely, this is a model that we are going to continue growing quite aggressively, I think. Next slide, please. So in the prototype, we provided training opportunities for 10 Indigenous trainees. 50% of those are coming straight out of the justice system. One of the cooler partnerships that actually came about during this prototype was a partnership with Stony Mountain Penitentiary, where a lot of the, we were pre-panelizing the wall sections in Stony Mountain using trainees that were currently in the prison system. That let us do the framing really, really fast on site, which was helpful. It let us sort of get to enclosure and lock up really quickly. Then as those folks are getting out, both on work release parole and being released, we're guaranteeing them work positions on this home. So that's been really fantastic, having folks both, working on the house in Stony Mountain and then coming and joining our work crews as soon as they are getting out of Stony Mountain. We know that that's where recidivism happens in that first couple of weeks after people get out. And so being able to support people from day one has been a really huge impact for us. The final home is going to be offered for sale for $230,000 with no down payment through a partnership with Manitoba Tipi Matawa, which is an Indigenous low-income homeownership program. Next slide, please. I'll run through this pretty fast. I've got 1 minute left. We've got a number of amazing partnerships that have made this happen. The city of Winnipeg has been donating the land. Like I was talking about, Stony Mountain Penitentiary, Manitoba Tipi Matawa, Province of Manitoba provided funding to capitalize the second mortgage on the first round. And in the future, instead of relying on funding to capitalize that second mortgage, we're looking to work with investment partners. And so that's a process that's ongoing right now as we move from the kind of prototyping to scaling phases. Next slide, please. Actually, let's skip to the next slide after that, since we are short on time. So, really what we're looking to do is spend the next 5 years scaling within Winnipeg. I'd like to get us up to building, about 20 houses a year. We want to be scaled to the size where we can access CMHC's shared equity mortgage program, which when we're just doing 1 or 2 houses a year, honestly, the scale is too small. After that, though, we're really well connected with a number of social enterprises operating across the country. I see no reason why this model couldn't really scale to continue combining, social enterprise development with shared equity mortgages across the country. So that's, when I look sort of 5 years plus, that's what I imagine. I'd love to be partnering with social enterprise builders in Sudbury and Saskatoon and, Hamilton, Ontario, and all the great work that's happening across the country. I think building houses is a fantastic training opportunity and can also help provide low barrier access to homeownership for folks who are traditionally locked out of the market. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. You really show what data equity in housing looks like. So on to our next round of speakers. I'm going to invite Marilyn Struthers and Rosalind Morrison, who represent the Institute of Southern Georgian Bay. Rosalind is the chair of the board of directors there, and Marilyn is a consultant and she runs her own consulting agency, Marilyn Struthers & Co. So passing it over to both of you.
Thank you. So I'm Marilyn Struthers, and believe you me, this was all volunteer work on the part of many, many, many people. I just want to express our appreciation for the opportunity to bring folks from our rural community on the shores of Georgian Bay into the lab process. We learned a lot, and I would say that we're not building anything yet but community, and that's been really such an interesting journey. So this is a shift time. It's not business as usual. We've experienced COVID, climate change, the housing crisis. And in a shift time, small communities like ours experience cascades of unpredictable change. And they're all problems not of our making. Local becomes much more important because the impact is right here. And local municipal roles are changing as they are called to find solutions that mitigate harm, and citizens are expecting more. Next slide, please. So what we chose to do is explore social finance solutions to the housing crisis, really different patterns of financialization. And social finance is not really well known in our communities, but we're very keen on exploring the role that our small municipalities can play. With an overlook across a number of municipalities, we could see that some are responding with more creativity and more success than others. And so we had a lot of discussion and thought about that. And the aha is that the difference is about the culture of municipal operation, really how people think, less about regulation and financing and more about how councillors and staff use local government processes to amplify community wealth and to approach solution finding. So municipal engagement in a rural community in the housing crisis is super important, not only because they approve development, but because they are the largest custodians of community wealth. We just don't have the density or wealth of urban nonprofit sectors, nor do we have more than a couple of social enterprises in our community. So the short presentation here in my next is probably 4 minutes is really the bones of an orientation for new municipal councillors. It's part of a toolkit for municipalities that we've been building through the lab. So 3 good frameworks that support municipal problem solving, and a menu of 7 practices we're building into a workshop that we see municipalities using to find solutions. And I'll just say, you know, it was not a group of people in a small room making this up. We really had a lot of support from Yvonne Hamlin, who's the new mayor of Collingwood, Shirley Keaveney, who is the deputy mayor of Meaford, and Carol Merton, who's a returned councillor in Owen Sound. So people with a lot of lived experience of municipal practice in housing. Next slide, please. So the first of the 3 good ways of thinking is to see our communities like an ecosystem made up of many local systems of care, of business, families, worship, and so on. And these systems are in turn embedded in the greater systems where the shifts are actually happening, whether it's climate change and weather, politics, monetary policy, inflation, healthcare, the housing crisis. This view invites small municipal councils to ask, how do we support sustainable and resilient local systems? Next, please. We can group those smaller community systems into 3 community level categories by impact. This will be familiar to many of you, but we do not tend to use this in municipal practice. Impact on people, on planet, and on profit. And to stay mindful of what each of those subsystems needs to thrive. The super important thing about this model for rural communities is that we often see these systems as deeply siloed, as if they operate alone. But at the community level, they are deeply interrelated. Homeless people move into the downtown cores, as happened in one of our study communities, and every single business is impacted. The best new solutions are almost always generated at the intersections. Social enterprise housing development, like you've just heard about, municipal guarantees on community loan funds or bonds that leverage local investment, and social procurement. Municipal governments are positioned right in the middle of this story. They are the only bodies with influence on all 3 spheres. And really, this is a largely unexplored opportunity in rural to leverage community wealth strategies and to develop intersectoral conversations for solution. This is happening more in the cities, but it can certainly happen in rural too. Next, please. As a system spanning tool, SDG 11 could help municipalities to identify the elements of a sustainable community and the opportunities at those intersections. One of our study municipalities boasts 370 new units this year, but are they affordable to the low-wage workers who fuel our current economic drivers, which are healthcare, think PSWs, tourism and retail? And if not, what happens next? No housing, no employees, and no business. So we started to survey businesses on the impact of the housing crisis. And we wonder, what is the local measure that links housing affordability to incomes in key sectors of the local economy? We have the stats can measure precarity, but we can't link it to those critical local salary levels of critical businesses. So in terms of planning, the opportunity is for rural municipalities to focus housing plans not just on hope for growth, but on current workforce sustainability requirements, and to update regularly enough to count for the impact of the crisis. And it's interesting that very few, if any of our municipalities actually foresaw the rental crisis in those low-wage sectors that we rely on. Next, please. And so this is our menu of municipal practices that will help our rural municipalities move from a traditional focus, often on things like roads and bridges, and support the capacity to engage in big problem solving, not for, but with the community. Because our small local governments lack scale with each other, this culture shift in our region's sustainability may in fact depend on. So I'll just run through these really, really quickly. Focus on community resilience. So not stability here. Finding local neutral learning spaces we've provided an every 2-week gathering, which the municipal politicians who participate refer to as Switzerland because it's just a neutral thinking place. Engage the wisdom of the community. We have lots of retired folks who would be more than glad to support the search for definitions. Shared definitions is extraordinarily important. We found that many of our municipalities are making up their own definitions of affordability, and seeing as how that is a link for collaborative action, to have common definitions, that's a bit of a problem. So I'll leave you with the rest, but very much appreciate our opportunity to explore within our own community here.
Thank you so much. Roz, if you want to put a last few words in.
I will. Just a few thoughts that I'd like to leave everybody with. As Marilyn said, job number one for us is to build community. And we found that the silo culture is healthy here, and we need to do a lot of work in terms of collaborating and having intersectoral discussions. So just quickly, the slides I want to leave you with is to think about this. It is about developing social capital. It is about developing connections between people and sharing knowledge. Why? Because we have to build the trust to do things differently that we've never done before. It's going to be risky for all of us, and we will all have to contribute in some way. Next slide, please. The thing that we focused on, and I'll just spend one more minute, is to really understand how we can create a YIMBY movement. We all know what NIMBY means in terms of not in my backyard, but how do we create a YIMBY movement? And we've got a plan for that. Next slide, please. And we've discovered that we're going to start with workshopping with our toolkit. We are going to bring those intersectoral conversations together in public. We want to really talk about what the community wants with the official plans being reviewed right now. We want to nurture safe places for conversation and civility, and we want to share success stories moving from community opposition in our backyard to tolerance. Why? Because we understand that affordable housing and the crisis that we're in is affecting all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosalind and Marilyn. I love the YIMBY slogan. It's been my favorite one from this lab. And the Institute of Southern Georgian Bay has certainly put together a really energetic group working on some of these pieces. I'll pass it on to Ian Bird and Andrea Nempton once again. Andrea, you already know. Ian is the co-founder of the Chelsea Commons and the Canadian chair of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Passing it over to both of you.
Thanks, Miriam. Great to share some of the findings from our cluster group in the lab. We had a really diverse group of participants involved with purpose-driven developments from the Yukon to Vancouver, Western Quebec, Waterloo region, Toronto, Brampton, and then some real experts who've been resourcing and supporting purpose-driven developments for quite some time. So our group sort of galvanized around the ways in which multi-purpose developments have a kind of comprehensive effect on all aspects of community. And we felt that we could zero in on how to make a shift or support a shift around what we would be considered normal in the development space, where over time, increasingly purpose-driven development becomes the norm and is sought after and well supported, and begins to respond to what communities are focused on.
How are you? How'd it go?
If we could just go to the next slide. What we zeroed in on in terms of the problem was in part the definition of purpose-driven development, to give us that focus on those subject areas you see at the top of the slide around affordability, community wealth creation, centering health, recreation, so other social supports in the development process, not as externalities or as community benefits, but central to the methodology and the outcomes associated with the developments. And to crowd in affordability around all of this, such that the benefit flows to those residents in those homes equitably. And our response to that problem was to say, built off the recognition that most of us that were involved in these, such as in my case with the development of a community land trust in Chelsea, most of us felt that we were setting out on our own, that we were isolated actors, or we were novel actors, or we thought we were doing something for the first time. And as we connected in the lab, we realized that in fact, there was a scale. It's just the scale lacked connection. And as you've just heard from Kaylin and Mike and Roz and Marilyn, they're similarly aligned, and they're similarly working in their places and on their projects. And we felt, what if there was a growing connection, a growing network, a constellation of purpose-driven actors that would create scale and therefore impact towards normalizing this form of development. And so when we got deeper into it, the scaling really, responds to some of the social innovation methodologies, where you're trying to scale deep, where you're really supporting the incumbents, those that are there already, those who are ready to go, and helping them to learn, supporting them with training, bridging with financial resources, bringing together lessons learned from one place to be applied in another. And so that scaling deep builds significant capacity, and part of the go forward plan would be to source and identify specific projects in, let's say, a dozen regions across the country to go much deeper on the learning and to really network those projects in a really fulsome way. But scaling deep is just one part of it. Scaling out would be sort of broadening the reach, really trying to find new entrants and perhaps the kind of community-based approach, like we just heard of from Marilyn and Roz, is part of where we're going to find new entrants. That the scale of the challenge around affordability is persistent, it's everywhere, and if we can scale out, we can expand our reach without having to scale up the enterprises right across the country. Next slide, thanks. You'll see that SI Canada is stepping up to be a co-designer and a host for that Go Forward program. And I think the call to action for those of you that are joining us today is to identify yourself with SI Canada, to connect your initiatives into this network, to bring your insights, knowing that you'll have the benefit of those shared back to you. And then in time, this network, this alliance, this constellation of actors will start to co-create and roll out common offerings around learning, around partnership building, around resources, and as you'll soon hear from Andrea, around some innovative ideas around funding and finance. So look forward to hearing from you, and in turn from us back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Andrea, do you want to sum up for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think what we saw from this systems approach, thank you, Ian, and thank you to all of the presenters. It's so inspiring. And what we saw is a kind of continuum, you know, projects that are happening in communities, for communities, by communities, or having this sort of very deep impact on individuals and changing their lives in a really profound way. And then we have the next sort of phase of actors who are, and they're sort of the actors, they're the innovative actors in this garden in Winnipeg and hopefully eventually across the country. And then we have the municipalities are leaning in and saying, how can we enable this and support this? And how can we find ways to ensure that these kinds of changes are happening in our communities? And what Ian's talking about is there a new kind of developer that can come in and also help to create that process and to actually think of things in a different way when they're designing the work that they're doing, and what can they learn from this? And I sort of went to the last one is really to tell you about a community wealth cluster that was a group of, and I'll do it very quickly, I think we're actually out of time. So it was a group of nonprofit developers. Between all of them, they sort of added up their combined assets. They were just local in Toronto, and they had about $1 billion worth of real estate assets that were valued at about $1 billion worth of real estate. And they were trying to figure out, it's very hard to be a nonprofit affordable housing developer, trying to figure out how to leverage those assets to be able to increase the impact of their work in their communities. We'll just go to the next slide. There was also at the same time another group that was working with RealPAC, and Michael Brooks is going to be speaking, that was talking about how can for-profit developers help to lean in more to affordable housing, or building affordable housing, and looking at different financial instruments. And by the end of the, I'll tell you the punchline, but by the end of the lab, these two clusters actually ended up combining and sort of moving together. The challenges, there's a number of challenges in the marketplace. There's costs, people have talked about construction costs, there's also crazy interest rates and real estate prices. And there's developers, there's a complexity in the system around financing things. The financial institutions, they have a real challenge around nonprofit and affordable around managing risk, both the perceived financial risk and as well as because the structures are different, and the social risk. You know, they can't just sort of foreclose in the same way they can on an office building. Institutional investors, pension funds, and the big banks and all the large people that have large amounts of assets have difficulty finding vehicles they can put large amounts of assets into and invest in. And retail investors have very little opportunity, even if they want to, even if I want to invest in affordable housing, there's very few places that I can do that and invest my funds for that. And the CMHC and the federal government have this massive complex challenge that they have the accountability and responsibility to solve. For the nonprofits, the stewards of deep, long-term affordable housing, all of these are even more challenging. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's a lot of it's about the structure of their systemic structure of their financial statements, the kind of financing that's available, their governance documents, and all of these things mean that despite everyone's good intentions, everything's a little bit challenging. Let's go a little bit to the next one. So we these two groups came together and thought about how might we, okay, so I just want to stop for 1 second. With the nonprofits, what turned out was that they really needed affordable, flexible, and responsive capital. And so we started to look at how might we design a financial instrument that will flow efficient, flexible capital to increase the supply of affordable housing in Canada, that will attract new capital. So not just the philanthropists that have been doing the small projects that are currently going, that it would be flexible and actually support the needs of the nonprofit sector that need different kinds of capital. They need sort of early loans so they can snatch up that building, and they need interim financing and bridge, that it could be enabled some fast tracking at the CMHC that sometimes is very slow to respond, that could support nonprofit ownership. We really believe that nonprofit ownership in its structure has the capacity to build sustainable, affordable units and create a fund that is scalable and perpetual, so that we're not just doing one shot of capital into the marketplace and then it's over and the problems persist, and contributes to long-term supply of affordable housing in perpetuity. So I think that we sort of looked at some successful strategies in other jurisdictions, which we'll share the slides, and I won't go through those now. We'll go to the next slide. And we looked at all of the current programs and incentives through the CMHC to make sure that we could align with them and help to facilitate and almost be a bit of WD-40 on this. And what we actually came up with is the creation of supporting a housing sector through a fund to provide, as I said before, this efficient, affordable, and flexible financing that includes bridge construction, term, second mortgages, and equity to nonprofit providers. For the for-profit providers, because this fund would also be accessible to them, it would not provide the equity, but it would still provide those kinds of funding. We would be looking for some catalytic investment from government sources, and it would be complementary to the current sources of funding. It would generate, there would be an investment through a charity, so that would generate revenue to fund programs to continue to build the field. There's lots more details. I can talk about this for hours, but I want to make sure there's so many. I want to make sure that we have time for our panelists. I don't think there's any other slides. There's maybe one more slide that just goes through the structure, but we'll leave it at this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. As you can see, there's no shortage of solutions coming out of this lab, and there's so much more to dive into, which is why I really recommend you go through the roadmap reports that were shared with you in advance of this event. You're going to find a lot more detail there, and we're always happy to talk to you by email and other platforms and respond to your questions. I now want to transition us to our panel discussion, where I have three brilliant people with me today, two from our lab, Michael Brooks, who is the CEO of RealPAC, and Khulud Baig, who is the policy advisor for Keepers of the Circle and for the Housing and Homelessness and Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and Sarah Lyons, who's the Director of Capacity and Sector Development at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Welcome, and thank you for your time, and so good to see you all. I want to build on what we heard in the lightning talks. And so maybe first ask our team from the Keepers of the Circle, what were some of the ways in which participating in this lab aided your work and helped you better partner with communities and meet their needs?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here, Mariam, and the team from Social Innovation Canada. It's been an absolute pleasure working with Social Innovation Canada over the last year. And some of the work that how we started doing this work really at Keepers of the Circle was to think about how can we work with and center on women and Indigenous women and gender diverse people and use that as sort of like fuel to like launch us into this work. So working within the lab setting and working with other partners that are also looking at similar questions and asking and answering similar questions has been very helpful in terms of like thinking, putting heads together and thinking about what possible solutions could be. I think one of the challenges when you're trying to do something outside the box or you're trying to be creative is figuring out what potential pathways are, what could be possible barriers and challenges, probably things that you're not seeing or things that might be in your blind spot that other people have thought through or worked through. So that has been one of the really like critical points, and it has helped us bring that knowledge back to the people we've been working with, and also look through solution building, taking the local knowledge that the group has and the local knowledge and the work that has already been done in the community, and how can that sort of knowledge we've generated through our partnerships and working together in clusters be used to stir the work and shape and mold the work for our future directions.
Thank you so much, Khulud, and an apology on my end. Sarah's name is pronounced as Sarah Lyons and not Leon, so my bad there. Thank you, Khulud. That's incredibly powerful. And actually, Sarah, I want to build on this with you. How do you think municipalities can really learn from the experience of community-based models, such as the one from Keepers of the Circle?
Thanks, Mariam. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. Bonjour tout le monde, c'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous. My name is Sarah Lyons. As mentioned, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from unceded Mohawk territory in Montreal. I found this presentation really inspiring, quite obviously. It's incredible work of engagement, creativity, and innovation. I'll say right off the top, in a general sense, with my Federation of Canadian Municipalities hat on, I think that this lab work between Social Innovation Canada, CMHC, and all you other partners is a place, you know, I'm hopeful that FCM can play a role in bringing awareness and spotlight, scaling and adoption to all this innovation. In respect of this project in particular, you know, what I really took from it was the role of the municipality, which, you know, as it was described by Kaylin, was, you know, they were not the leaders of this project, but they had a role to play, but one where the leadership was in community, and the innovation and the wisdom, you know, Kaylin mentioned the elders and the matriarchs, was outside of the municipality. And it makes me think about, this is not directly on the topic of housing, but I think it's a fundamental of this kind of work. A program at FCM that I'm involved in called SETI, which is around creating real relationship between municipalities and adjacent First Nations. And it's a really relationship-focused program. And so we often talk about, you know, having been neighbors for hundreds of years, but not being neighborly, and the problems associated with the lack of real community-to-community or government-to-government relationship at the local level. And so I'm just reflecting that I think those kinds of programs, which are not about housing, strictly speaking, are part of the journey on these kinds of innovations and community-led housing. I might add that, you know, from a policy and advocacy perspective, FCM has been very active in calling on the federal government to put more funding into Indigenous housing strategies. I think we've recently been calling, and don't quote me on this because I'm not part of that team, but I believe it's $3 billion is what we've been most recently doing advocacy around. And I might close by just saying, you know, another piece we've been working on, which I think fits the themes around this Indigenous leadership, Indigenous self-management, Indigenous community building and innovation, is the notion of mainstreaming our approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, reconciliation, gender equality into all of our work, into our policy work, our advocacy work, our projects, our programs. And I think, you know, from the perspective of the municipal sector, it's as we take leadership on that kind of stuff that we create an enabling and a capacity to partner on projects like these.
Thank you, Sarah. Shifting us a little bit into the flip side of this, or not necessarily flip, but the other side of the spectrum, Michael, and bringing it to you, we've heard what municipalities and other areas can learn from community-based approaches, but there's so much also to learn from for-profit developers, the private sector. And where do you think that is? What are some of the key pieces that the private sector can bring to this conversation?
Thank you, Miriam, and hello to my colleagues. And let me also thank SI Canada. We had a terrific journey through the cluster process over the past year. Learned a ton from our colleagues. I would say I'm still on that learning journey. Maybe it'll never end, but every time someone speaks, there's something else that I internalize from that. So again, thank you, Andrea and Ian and team, Mariam, for being engaged in that. How can we engage the private sector in the supply of affordable housing? First, I would say that, look, affordable housing, including Indigenous affordable housing, which is another very difficult topic, subsegment of that. It's a wicked problem. I have found that all political parties agree on this. You can't party shop this and think you're getting a better outcome from some. Everybody is focused on this. It's a difficult problem. The definitions of affordable housing are maybe a bit of a challenge. Most of our institutional apartment building owning members would tell you that, gee, you know, we screen tenants when they come in at 30% of household income. So we're kind of providing affordable housing. Most of our members are mid-market, and they're providing affordable housing, but it's not deeply affordable. And I have heard that the 80% of average market rental definition is met with derision, if I can put it that way, by some providers of affordable housing. So I think that the private sector, that's the mid-market area, is their sweet spot. I think their new supply, I think that helps as long as we can continue to encourage them. And you know what, look, through this whole process, I started this looking for a solution, a big picture solution for affordable housing. How do we get public money into this sector? Could we create an affordable housing REIT? Was our opening proposition with this group. Turned out by the time we finished it, very difficult to make new purpose-built rental pencil out with any kind of a meaningful percentage of affordable or deeply affordable units. And I think everybody's in that, even not-for-profits are in that boat now. Not too much pencils out in terms of new stuff these days. But we're very focused on existing supply. And you all know the headline topics there. Those are security of tenure, renoviction, housing as a human right, very focused on all of those issues and trying to figure out, I'm trying to figure out as an association, how can I move our institutional owners to a better place that's doing more for tenants? And we're making good progress, and this will be a long-term project for us. I think, Miriam, the second part of your question, maybe you didn't get to it yet, was what can the nonprofit sector learn from us? And I think be arrogant of me to say that there's anything necessarily, because there's a lot of really good not-for-profit operators. I would say I had calls today with 3 Indigenous not-for-profit operators of affordable housing. It's a different world than the private world. Chronically underfunded, typically small scale. Capital expenditure is a challenge. Operating expenditure is a challenge. Don't like some government programs. Don't like portable housing benefits. But I continue to admire that all of these groups are led by social purpose driven individuals. Actually, I was surprised by Andrea's quote that if you aggregated the NFPs in Toronto, you get to $1 billion. Because my
That was only a dozen of them.
That amazes me, because my initial reaction was there's not enough scale in the not-for-profit sector yet. And that's another challenge. How do we scale? And Ian maybe was talking about this. How do we scale the not-for-profit sector so that they can say to tenants, as long as you pay your rent, you stay here for life? I would like the private sector to be able to say that as well. That's a challenge, but I'm working on that too. Sorry for being long-winded.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for all that you're doing to push these 2 spaces together.
Yeah.
Khulud, I want to touch on that again. So what Michael said, right? Like, it's a whole other world, and it's an other world which really centers a very different kind of wisdom. And so maybe if we could hear a little bit from you around, how has centering community knowledge, especially Indigenous grandmothers' wisdom, played a role in the way your solution is being implemented?
For sure. And yeah, I just maybe want to preface this question to say that, like a lot of the knowledge that we were able to gather during our process came from the Wisdom Keepers Knowledge Council that works with Keepers of the Circle, and some sharing circles that we hosted. And, I think that when you talk to an elder, when you talk to a knowledge keeper, the first and foremost thing they're going to say is there's no solution until there's land back. So there is really, like, at the end of the day, the biggest question is, how do you get land restitution to Indigenous communities, to Indigenous women, to Indigenous matriarchs, and the self-governance and self-determination piece of them deciding how they want to live, where they want to live, and what that sort of even housing design, construction, ownership looks like for them. So, for us, like, that has been a very central question and principle, and that's been something that keeps coming up over and over again, even in the work that Mike's been leading and the work that Keepers of the Circle has been doing. So I think that the challenge then becomes is, like, how do you take systems that exist and make them work in ways that, like, meets community needs and meets the directions that communities want to go in. And that will always be, there will always be friction there, and there will always be, some agreements and some disagreements there. But I think the general principle stays: how do you get governance, ownership, and self-determination in the hands of the community in perpetuity, and what that looks like, and how housing plays a role in it, how land justice plays a role in it, how environmental justice plays a role in it, and how those pieces sort of work and fit together. So yeah, like, I think that I'm sure there's other people that we work with that could speak to this in much bigger, more detail, but it very centrally and very simply, it's a question of land restitution, and it's a question of self-determination and self-governance. Like, that is what's central. And, yes, the question gets a bit more complicated when we talk about folks that are in urban contexts or in rural contexts. The context in the north looks very different. Once we scale these models, what they could possibly look like in different localities is something that different communities would have to come together and figure out. But the general principles stay the same across the board. And that's what communities been talking about and fighting about for the longest period of time. So working and thinking around those lines has been sort of central to the work that Keepers of the Circle has led. And there's still many questions that are unanswered, and, things that we have to figure out along the way, but that continues to be a very central focus.
Thank you, Khulud. That's a really important point. And what it also sort of brings us to is, how do is there room for innovative approaches to address some of that? And then when we speak about innovative approaches, I mean, sure, there's tremendous work happening at the community level. We're clearly seeing that with your work and the Keepers of the Circle cluster. I want to bridge this with the municipal piece and ask you, Sarah, how do we create the space for more innovative models at the municipal level? How can pieces like social finance and lessons from the community, help make things better at the municipal level?
Thanks for the question, Mariam. I'm struck, I'm thinking of a conversation that I had a few months ago with the president of FCM, who is a city councillor in rural Alberta. And one of the things she said to me in this conversation was, I really reject the idea that municipalities, and in particular smaller rural municipalities, don't want to be innovative or progressive. It's a question of capacity. And so I think, one of the things that is missing in this kind of ecosystem is the ability to, recognize that even in medium-sized local governments, you may have a very limited number of staff who can really engage in this kind of learning, this kind of open-ended creative construction. And so, what can we do to kind of smooth out that gap? One kind of hopeful thing on the horizon would be the federal government's Housing Accelerator Fund, which of course FCM is hoping can do some of that work of unlocking, approval and permit processes, providing learning around zoning practices, helping with best practices around local pressure from residents. So the sort of NIMBY to YIMBY conversion, to use the words we've used in this webinar, to address the scarcity of available land. These are all, someone said at the beginning of this is a really complex problem. And I think in terms of bringing the innovation into the municipal sphere, it's not a lack of interest. I think it's for the most part a lack of capacity. And we're hopeful that the Housing Accelerator Fund will be part of filling that gap. I'm hopeful that the continued evolution of this work will be part of that gap. And I'm hopeful that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, besides all the advocacy we're doing, on the design side of federal money, to see funding for the conversion of vacant commercial spaces, to see funding for the redesign and expansion of federal lands initiatives, et cetera, to see funding for the purchase of buildings, to keep them out of financialization and maintain the existing affordable market, that we can also play a role in actually helping our members, some 2,000 local governments across the country, to really do the work of accessing this more innovative funding that's available, but also accessing the wisdom and amazing ideas, such as the ones we're hearing about today, that are coming from community. To touch quickly on social finance, clearly there are a number of strategies, some of them were talked about here. There's the idea of kind of churches and other religious spaces that may be underutilized. I can tell you as a resident of Montreal, our community is just full of huge and amazing spaces. And, my own child went to a not-for-profit daycare in a church. Community bonds, co-ops, others have mentioned some of them. I think all those things, I'm hopeful, will kind of become more mainstream. And, maybe I'll just close by saying I was, struck by the presentation that Rosalind and Marilyn made, talking about, to what extent it's the people and the culture of the local government that are key. I think there's something there in terms of, creating communities of practice, the toolkits. It sounds like some of that great work has been done, and I'm kind of new to this conversation in the labs. So, you better believe I'll be following up with Marilyn and Rosalind to learn more about that.
That is wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Michael, I'm going to come to you for some quick thoughts once again on that bridging piece. What can these spectrums learn from each other, and how do we continue this all hands on deck approach to address housing inaffordability?
You're going farther and deeper on this one, are you? On this bridging piece, yeah. As I said, this is a challenge for me right now. It's interesting the context that we're in. It's like profit's a dirty word in Canada right now, and we've seen it with some groups being accused of pandemic profiteering, grocery companies and pharmaceutical companies and others, and we're kind of lumped into that. We're kind of lumped into that bucket right now as a group as well. And the private sector has its own challenges right now. The required return on investments for new construction isn't there. I mentioned this before. New supply doesn't really pencil out when you've got interest rates that start at 5 or 6%. Not without a rise in rents, which is going to be anathema to anybody who's trying to keep rents low. So what gives? What helps you bridge that gap? You probably know that the public real estate companies, including the REITs, are trading 15 to 20% below net asset value, and sometimes more. They've been as low as 30% below net asset value. So they can't raise any money to do any more developments. They're stuck. They're frozen. So that's the reality in kind of those public markets. So what's the way forward? We're certainly focusing on existing stock, and I talked a little bit about this in my first response. I know Sarah's probably focused on this. I'm sure Claude's focused on this existing stock, and how do we maintain the affordability of that existing stock without letting it deteriorate? That is a critical point in my mind, because we all know of negative stories of government-controlled and government-run affordable housing corporations that are way behind in their maintenance, and to me, that's not a solution. In fact, I've even seen stories of condos that need a major repair, and they don't have a big enough reserve fund to cover the major repair. So, to me, maintaining, repairing, even upgrading some of these older buildings is a critical imperative. I think the private sector has access to capital, and most of times is best placed to do that. But we've got to figure out a better way to take care of those tenants who can't keep up. And while some are going to demonize above guideline rent increases, inflation's way higher than what the as of right is in most provinces. It's 2% in BC. Inflation was 7%. It's similar in Ontario, 2.5%, I think, in Ontario. Natural gas is up 40%. Everyone wants a wage increase. I mean, if you looked at the op cost side of the owner's side, it isn't pretty either. So that's the challenge that we have to bridge. And I think that we all sit around a circular table, Khulud. We sit around a circular table and we talk. And we understand each other's perspectives, which is what I'm doing. And then we try to come to some middle ground. We have to do that.
Thank you all so much. This has been an incredibly powerful, inspiring, thought-provoking conversation. We're going to take a few minutes to address some questions. One of the questions that just come up from Michelle is, I wonder if it's important to tackle the root of our orientation to housing as a commodity. Profit isn't dirty, it's how it's used. Should housing be a means for individuals to earn equity while people are homeless? And is it time to tackle the mindsets and policies? Do folks want to address this? And feel free to unmute and go right for it.
Well, I'm going to post in here. Most of you are not going to like it. I'm going to post in here an article from this morning's Financial Post, which talks about Marxism and talks about this spiral down for the welfare state. And if you're going to listen to me, you need to understand that we can't be subsidizing everybody all the time. In a rent control regime, if I'm a young lawyer making $200,000 a year, I love rent control. I got so much disposable cash, but I'm not the person to whom rent control should be targeted at. It should be those most in need. So we have a lot of free riders already in our system. Can we afford to free ride everybody? No. We've got to be much more targeted in our approach to how we deal with this. And that's the round table conversation. Let's not demonize profit. Let's not demonize private ownership. Financialization is the only way these things get built. It's 89% of the market in Canada is private sector. It's the only way they get built. It's the only way they get repaired and maintained and upgraded. It's not a demon. And I'm now going to let some of my colleagues contradict me while I post the article. Apologies if I've offended anybody.
I don't know if I should maybe go next and follow Michael on your takes. I say, yeah, let's let everybody free ride, because why not? If that means everybody gets a home, then everybody gets a home. And I say that like knowing the restrictions of the system that we're currently in. And like some of the work that we've been doing recently with Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, which is really focused on like housing as a human right and what that practically systematically looks like. What does that mean? What does that entail? And part of what the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate is currently looking at is financialization and the impacts that Canada's having. I think the problem is how uncapped profits are and how much they're extracting value from a very regular everyday person just trying to live and survive. And I say that because I was part of a meeting yesterday, and I think recently I've just been on a lot of tables that have been having these conversations, because time and again it seems like we come across that this is the only way to move forward and this is the only way to do things. And maybe I have not fully bought into that yet, and maybe I'm still very hopeful to different ways of doing things and really thinking about why is it that something that is such a basic human right, something that enables safety in our lives, something that enables our ability to live and protect people, ourselves, our families, is so commodified and so out of reach. Like, when I initially started working in housing and homelessness, like we were mainly worried about like big urban cities and where rents were going in there. Now, like it's even smaller cities, like rural neighborhoods, like people that are from, that used to be able to rent for $800 and $900. We're now looking at rents upwards of $1,700 and $1,800 for the same units, and the increase in rents is not equaling to better quality of apartments or better quality of units. It's not leading to more adequate housing. So even if it is the only way to do things, it's not really improving like quality of life for people or the dignity of the housing accommodations that are available to people. So I think that we have to question the commodification that is happening of real estate and housing in Canada right now. And if there's anything that we have to learn from like a lot of different places around the world, this is not the only way to do housing. This is not the only way that we can build housing and ensure that people live in proper housing, and I think that there's many, I think we live within a certain system, and our system allows and not allows for us to be able to do certain things. Like even with the project at Keepers of the Circle, one of our biggest questions is land and acquisitions, and how do we get that sort of the dollars to do that. But that's because we also exist in certain like systemic barriers that don't allow for us to do that. So again, like I think that the change has to be at policy levels, and we really have to reckon with what housing as a human right means in terms of policy. And particularly because when you look at the gendered side of homelessness and housing, you really see how uncapped profits extract value and dignity from people that really are at the lowest strata of society, who are on ODSP or other income assistance, who might be struggling with mental health challenges or substance abuse challenges, single mother-led families being impacted the most. So without going on a rant on this, I think I really do struggle with the idea that financialization is our only way.
Okay, so clearly what we're starting is the beginning of a table. you will hear more from us. There are so many questions. We are going to attempt to answer all of these in an email to the participants. Give us a little time to wrap our heads around this. But all that to say, this is the beginning of these conversations. These are extremely pertinent, important, crucial, urgent debates and challenges. This is the beginning. And so stay tuned. You will hear more. For our participants and panelists, I think we're going to put together something closed and intimate and dive deeper, because you're right. This needs to be a circle, and that starts with us. So thank you all. Going to pass it to Andrea to close us off for the day.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. That was just fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you to everyone who is engaging with us in the chat. I haven't seen all of the questions and the comments, and I'm really looking forward to looking through them. You know, at one point, Andrew was going to say how this lab started with Steph, and I forget his name, and Andrew can write it in the chat. Gentleman,
Steph Jones.
Steph Jones, who is leading innovation at CMHC, and Tanya Sermon at an event, and they said, this is not going to work. You have to get everyone in the room. You have to get the nonprofits in here. You need to get the entrepreneurs in here. We need to have a different kind of conversation. And that's how this lab was born, was the two of them sort of having a conversation about a new way to have different conversations. And at one point he suggested that we could look at financialization for housing. So how do we ensure that we have a yes and approach? How do we ensure that we have options? There's no silver bullet to this, because we're very, very different folks. And many people don't want to live in a big house by themselves. They would rather have shared ownership and community. And how do they have access to the funds that they need to develop that? And the policies stop being barriers, but are incentives. Mm-hmm. These are the kinds of things that we're looking at. And it's been so, you know, I'm so grateful for the radical candor, you know, the actual real conversation about the issues that matter that you've all brought yourselves to today. It's 2:30. I'm going to sign off. I'm going to say, please, if you want to know more about a deep dive on financialization, you can read our report on financialization. It's big and thick and was really done by some smart folks. And we're also going to, we've emailed you executive summaries with roadmaps. That is what these presentations were pulled from. And we'll see if we can share the slides as well. And please stay engaged. Sign up for our email and our newsletter, our financialization of, or our social finance newsletter, and just email us.